There's something profoundly unsettling about scrolling through social media these days, isn't there? At least that's what I hear from people. I don't really go on social media, but you're lying in bed at night, thumbing through Instagram or Facebook, and just about every post seems to be someone else's highlight reel. She just got promoted to VP of sales. He's posing, hair perfectly coiffed, with his equally perfect family in front of the Arc de Triomphe or something like that. And your deadbeat college roommate, well, he just bought a Tesla Plaid, 0 to 60 in 2.1 seconds. Now in possession of a man who previously would lumber to class at a speed of 2.1 inches per hour. And there you are, lying in the dark, wondering why everyone else seems to be winning at life. And you're still trying to figure out how on earth you agreed to marry a clergyman 14 years your senior. A little biographical there, but here's what strikes me as I think about it, and perhaps it's occurred to you as well, that for all the success stories we see parading across our iPhones, there's something a bit hollow about it all, and we'll get to that. Well, we saw as we've been studying this book of Ecclesiastes that the key expression is, well, one that comes in verse 1 of chapter 4, under the sun. Do you see it there? The teacher, as the author King Solomon calls himself, is looking at life as if God were not involved, up there, but not really interested in us. Too busy running a universe to be bothered about getting involved with life on planet Earth. It's life under the sun. Now that, of course, is how most people live in our present age. Most people are not atheists, categorically denying the existence of God. I've only met one or two real atheists. Most are like this here, viewing the world from under the sun. The atheists are always a bit shaken up when it comes to death. That's really what separates the atheist from the agnostics, doesn't it? Faced with the death of a loved one, very few people believe that there's nothing beyond this life. That's just too painful to believe when we're facing death. You've got to believe something. Now, most people are not dyed-in-the-wool atheists, but just like this, under the sun, that's how they live life. God may be up there, but he's really not interested or involved in our lives. And so let's begin chapter 4 at the natural starting point with verse 1. Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. Notice how he says, and I looked again. Solomon is not a casual observer of life. He's still searching for answers. He keeps going, keeps searching again and again and again. And he's been watching human behavior, and he keeps coming back to that same troubling pattern. The strong prey upon the weak, and the weak having nowhere to turn. And isn't this exactly what we've been seeing in our own time? Like what happened in East Palestine, Ohio, back in 2023, when that train derailed that was carrying hazardous materials. You see, for weeks, residents complained about headaches, burning eyes, dead fish in the streams, and all the while the company executives and the government officials seemed far more concerned with managing the public relation crisis than addressing the health concerns of ordinary families. The tears of the people who felt their voices didn't matter, who sensed that power was on the side of the oppressors. And our teacher repeats the haunting phrase twice, and they have no comforter. Not once, but twice. It's as if he can't get over it in a world under the sun where God is treated as sort of an absentee landlord. There's no ultimate source of comfort for those who suffer injustice. You see, what Solomon is observing here isn't just the existence of oppression that's been around since Cain and Abel. What he's noticing is the particular desolation that comes when the oppressed have no advocate, no comforter, no higher court of appeal. In a world without God actively involved, the strong simply do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. Look at verses 2 and 3. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. Better than both is the one who had never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Now, that's a shocking statement, isn't it? The teacher is saying that in a world of unchecked oppression, death is preferable to life. And never having existed at all is the best option of all. This isn't suicidal ideation we're hearing. This is the logical conclusion of a marvelously wise person thinking about existence without God, without divine justice. I'm reminded of something Woody Allen once said, and Woody Allen, you may know this, he spent his entire career with this theme of meaninglessness. He said, I'm not afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens. Sensible enough. Well, that's the sort of gallows humor that says something about this deep anxiety that we often feel about life itself, about existence. But our teacher is even more to the point. If this life is all there is, if power always wins and the powerless always suffer, why existence itself becomes kind of a cosmic cruelty, at best a cosmic joke. And we've been seeing this sort of attitude expressed in our present day with a recent surge in what social scientists call climate anxiety amongst young people. It's this feeling that the environmental crisis is so dire, so overwhelming, so inescapable, this eco-apocalypse bound to happen any day, that many are questioning whether it's even ethical to bring children into such a world. Better not to have been born than to see the evil that is done under the sun. I think that has a very contemporary ring to it. It's certainly not Christian. But Solomon isn't finished with his diagnosis. He moves now from oppression to achievement, and what he discovers is perhaps equally disturbing. Verse 4, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. All achievement springs from envy. It's a breathtaking claim, isn't it? Solomon is saying that when you strip away all the noble rhetoric about human progress and individual excellence, what you'll find at the core of most human ambition is simple jealousy. We work harder not because we love the work itself, but because we can't stand the thought of someone else getting ahead of us. Now, as we've discussed during the series, a large part of what Solomon says is hyperbole. He's getting us to think. He's making these huge statements to get our minds to think. And I guess if we think about it, how many great rivalries and conflicts of civilization have been motivated, at least in part, by sort of this competitiveness, competitive envy. Athens and Sparta, they were ultimately destroyed. Both city-states were destroyed in the Peloponnesian War. The competition between Britain and Germany for naval supremacy that helped precipitate World War I, the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union, two superpowers spending themselves into exhaustion, trying to prove ideological superiority. And by the way, we won that. We'll bring it down to a more personal level. How much of our own career ambition, if we're honest, is driven by not wanting to be left behind? How much of our consumer spending is motivated by keeping up with the Joneses? The house that was just a bit bigger than we needed, the car that was just a bit nicer than practical, the vacation we posted on Instagram that was just a bit more exotic than we could afford. As a matter of fact, at Lou and Donna's house, they showed us a seal of the Dutch East India Company. It reminded me of the South Sea Bubble of 1720. I read a whole book on it. Not for everybody, but thousands of British investors, many of them just ordinary shopkeepers and clerks, poured their life savings into shares of the South Sea Company, partly hoping to make money, but largely driven by the envy of their neighbors. They seemed to be getting rich overnight. And this whole speculative mania, it was fueled by social competition, the desire to keep up with the gentry, to prove one's financial sophistication. And when the bubble burst, countless families were ruined, while the company directors had already sold their shares and escaped with their fortune. I think Solomon would have saw that one coming, wouldn't he? Here's what's so brilliant about this. Solomon isn't just saying that envy motivates bad behavior. He's saying that envy motivates what we consider good behavior, our work ethic, our pursuit of excellence, our commitment to achievement. You see, take God out of the equation, and even our virtues become vices. It's rather like what C.S. Lewis said, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. When life is merely under the sun, with no transcendence, no purpose, no divine calling, then even our finest accomplishments become ways of keeping score with our neighbors. Solomon calls this a meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And isn't that exactly what it feels like when you've gotten something you thought you wanted, only to discover that the satisfaction lasts about 5 minutes before you're looking around to see what the next person has that you don't? Now, having delivered his devastating diagnosis of human ambition, our teacher then offers what might seem to us like contradictory advice. Verses 5 and 6. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. At first glance, this does look like a contradiction, right? In verse 4, he just told us that all achievement is driven by envy and therefore meaningless. But now here in verse 5, he's saying that people who don't work at all are fools and will ruin themselves. So which is it? Should we make an effort or shouldn't we? Well, here's where the wisdom of Ecclesiastes is going. Solomon isn't advocating for laziness. He's pointing towards a third way between envy-driven ambition and self-destructive idleness. He's talking about contentment. One handful with tranquility. Contentment. Quite a revolutionary thing. Both in Solomon's day and in our own. We live in a culture that constantly tells us that more is better, that we should never be satisfied with what we have, that according to Gordon Gekko, greed is good. Our entire economic system is built on the assumption that people will always want more than they currently have. But the teacher is suggesting something altogether different. There's a point where enough is enough, where the peace that comes from contentment is worth far more than the stress that comes from ambition. Think of some of the great figures of Christian history who've learned this lesson. Take Francis of Assisi. It's a brilliant movie made about his life called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, way back in the 70s, vintage. But anyhow, he was born into a very wealthy family, a merchant family in medieval Italy, and he could have spent his whole life enjoying his riches and his social status. But instead, after this powerful conversion, he chose to live in poverty, voluntary poverty, and he found more joy in serving lepers and rebuilding ruined churches than his father ever had in the textile business. One handful with tranquility. Or consider a person we've talked about before, William Wilberforce, who gave up what could have been a very lucrative legal career or a comfortable life as a member of parliament, only to spend decades fighting the slave trade. He found satisfaction in his calling, not because it made him wealthy or famous, but because it aligned with his conviction about human dignity and godly justice. Our teacher would recognize this wisdom. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. And now if we would step back and see really what Solomon is doing in these 6 verses before us, he's painting a picture again of human nature, of life under the sun, what we're like when God is removed from the equation. And it's not a pretty picture, is it? Without God actively involved in our lives, we either become the oppressors or the oppressed, with ultimately no comfort for both. Without God as our reference point, our achievements become exercises in competition, competitive envy, we could say, rather than purpose and calling. Without God as our source of meaning, we were left to choose between the anxiety of endless aspiration or the poverty of just giving up altogether. But here's the thing, the very fact that these realities do disturb us is evidence that we were made for something more. Remember what we read back in chapter 3, verse 11, God has set eternity in our hearts. The reason that oppression without comfort feels wrong to us, the reason that envy-driven achievement feels hollow to us, the reason that we long for something better than endless competition, all of this points to the reality that we were designed for a different world, for a different kind of existence. You see, the teacher isn't trying to depress us with his observations about life under the sun. He's trying to make us homesick for heaven. He's showing us what we're reduced to when we try to live as if this material world is all there is. He's doing it so we'll reach for God, reach for something higher. Now think about the great freedom movements throughout Western history. Again, Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the struggle against apartheid, Pope John Paul II and the solidarity movement against communism in Poland. What drove these movements? Well, at their core was the gospel of Jesus Christ. It was the power of the cross. It was the conviction that oppression is wrong, that the powerful shouldn't be allowed to abuse the powerless, that there should be justice and comfort for those who suffer. But where does that conviction come from? We talked about it in chapter 3 that, are we just sophisticated animals? And are we just competing for scarce resources? I mean, if that's the case, why do we care about something like justice at all? Why shouldn't the strong dominate the weak? That's the natural outcome. The very fact that injustice makes us angry is evidence that we were made for a world where justice reigns. Evidence that we bear the image of God who cares about righteousness, who is righteousness. Or think about our dissatisfaction with purely competitive achievement. Why does winning the rat race make us feel empty? Why do successful people so often struggle with depression and anxiety? Why do we have phrases like money can't buy happiness or it's lonely at the top? Because we were made for purpose, not just achievement. We're made for community, not just competition, for worship, not just work. The very hollowness of success under the sun points us towards the possibility of success under heaven. Now, I just want to spend a moment here on the economic implications of what Solomon is saying, because I think it speaks directly to some of the pressing issues of our time. When Solomon says that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another, he's describing what economists call a zero-sum game. Wrote Malcolm Forbes, "He who dies with the most toys wins." A zero-sum game. It's this idea that for me to win, you have to lose. You see, in this worldview, there's only so much success, wealth, status, happiness to go around, and so I need to compete with you. I need to grab my share when I can. And this sort of thinking is evident in so much of our political and economic anxiety today. We're resentful when other people or other groups are doing better than we are. It's this assumption that if tech billionaires are getting richer, it must mean everyone else is getting poorer. We fail to realize that a rising tide lifts all boats. But here's what's so interesting. When our Lord talks about the kingdom of heaven, he constantly describes it in non-zero-sum terms. Give, and it will be given to you, he says. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. The parable of the loaves and fishes, the parable of the talents. Again and again, Jesus shows us an economy of abundance rather than scarcity. But let's push this analysis a bit further, because I think there's something our teacher sees here that we often miss in our discussions about success and achievement. Notice that the oppression he describes in verse 1 isn't just random violence or natural disaster, it's systematic oppression. Power was on the side of their oppressors. It's about hierarchies, ladders of success, where someone has to be on the bottom in order for someone else to be on top. That's how a lot of people talk these days. It's all power dynamics. And then please note that the achievement he describes in verse 4 is explicitly competitive. One person's envy of another. This isn't, you see, about individual creativity or even problem solving. This is about getting to the finish line faster. It's about winning the race. It's about climbing higher up the ladder, higher than anyone else can. Do you see the connection? The same system that creates oppression also creates the kind of achievement that leaves people empty and anxious. When your success is defined by your relative position in your workplace, in your community, wherever it is, when your success is divided as your relative position rather than your absolute contribution, then every step up the ladder means someone else is below you. It's a very contemporary thing. It's definitely not Christian, but everything is this struggle between power. This may be why also ultra-successful people do report being lonely and isolated. They spent their entire careers competing with the very people they might otherwise befriend. They've learned to see colleagues as threats rather than collaborators. They've internalized the message that vulnerability is weakness and that asking for help is failure. I think of the tragic story of Kate Spade, the fashion designer, built a $1 billion brand probably, but she struggled so much with life and meaning and depression and anxiety before taking her own life in 2018. Or Anthony Bourdain, the character he was. He had everything: wealth, fame, the opportunity to travel the world and eat amazing food, but he had internal demons that ultimately led to his suicide. And these weren't people who failed by the world's standards. They were people who succeeded brilliantly by the world's standards, but they discovered that worldly success couldn't fill the deeper longing for meaning and connection that God has placed in every human heart. Well, as we come towards the end of our time together this morning, I want to make sure we don't miss the invitation that's embedded in these difficult verses in Ecclesiastes. Yes, our teacher is painting a rather dark picture of life under the sun. He's exposing the futility of achievement that's driven by envy, the tragedy of oppression that goes uncomforted. But again, he's not doing this to crush our spirits, to make us cynical about human nature. He's doing it to make us hungry for something else. He's showing us the bankruptcy of a life without God so that we'll be motivated to seek a life with God. Remember, this is the same Solomon who also wrote, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight." This is the same king who prayed for wisdom rather than wealth when God offered him anything he wanted. And he knows that there is an alternative to the oppression and the envy that he describes. But that alternative requires what he also calls the fear of the Lord, a recognition that there is a God in heaven who sees all, who judges all, who offers comfort to all who turn to him. When we live with that recognition, when we make God rather than our circumstances or our achievements the reference point of our lives, everything changes. We don't have to compete with others because our worth doesn't depend on our relative position. We don't have to accumulate endlessly because our security doesn't depend on what we have. We don't have to dominate others because our significance doesn't depend on our power over them. Indeed, we can achieve from love rather than from envy. We could serve from abundance rather than scarcity. And this is what Jesus meant when he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." So what does this look like practically? How do we live differently in light of our passage today? Well, firstly, we learn to recognize the difference between godly ambition and worldly ambition. Godly ambition asks the question, how might I use these very gifts that God gave me? How can I use them to serve others and glorify God? And worldly ambition asks, how do I get ahead? How do I prove my worth? And the first one leads to fulfillment, and the second gets to exhaustion. Secondly, we learn to find our identity in who God says we are rather than what the world says, in our achievements or our possessions. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the beloved children of God. We are created in his image, redeemed by his grace. We're called to his purposes. And that's true whether we are successful or unsuccessful by the world's standards, whether we're rich or poor, whether we're powerful or powerless. And we learn to see other peoples not as competitors, but as friends in God's kingdom work. Instead of asking, how can I get the better of this person, we start asking, how can I bless this person? Instead of feeling threatened by others' success, we celebrated with them. Instead of being driven by envy, we're motivated by love. And admittedly, this is easier said than done. We learn to practice contentment. That's the next thing. We recognize that when we have enough, and to resist the cultural pressure to always want more. This doesn't mean we stop working or growing or achieving, But it does mean that we do these things from a place of gratitude and a place of purpose, and not from a place of anxiety and competition. And finally, we learn to be comforters for the oppressed and advocates for the powerless. We don't ignore injustice or pretend it doesn't exist. Neither do we despair about it or let it take us to cynicism. Instead, we become part of God's answer to the problem, and that is ultimately bringing people to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Let me just close with this thought. Solomon tells us that it's better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. But I would suggest that when God is set in the equation, even one handful becomes more than enough. When we're working for his glory rather than our own advancement, why small achievements become meaningful. Modest success becomes satisfying when we're resting in his love instead of seeking others' approval. Why even simple lives become very significant. I guess that's the secret that we all have to learn, that contentment isn't about having less, it's about wanting what you have. And we can only want what we have when we recognize it as a gift from a loving God who knows what we need, and he provides it in his time and in his way. And so the oppressed do have a comforter, the lonely do have a friend, the anxious do have a peace that passes all understanding, the guilty have forgiveness, the meaningless do have purpose. But these gifts only come when we try to stop living under the sun and start living under God's only Son, when we stop chasing the wind and start following the one who commands both the wind and the waves. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. But best of all is one heart, surrendered to the God who made us, who loves us, and calls us to find our rest in him. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for these honest words of the teacher, these words that strip away all our illusions about success and our illusions about achievement. And we confess that too often we've been motivated by envy rather than love, by competition rather than compassion, by anxiety rather than trust. Help us to see that you are the comforter of the oppressed, the friend of the lonely, the peace of the anxious. Indeed, help us to be living examples of what life looks like when you are at the center, purposeful, trusting, generous, liberated. We ask all this in the name of Jesus Christ, who became sin for us, took the blame, bore the wrath, so that we may stand forgiven at the cross. Amen.